Our topic this evening is, will Christianity survive the 21st century? Or maybe in less clickbaity terms, let's say, as Christianity in its medieval and early modern heartland of Europe is experiencing a very rapid demographic decline, and as we look at how all the trend lines are going, what will Christianity look like 100 years from now, say? And we tried to do this lecture a few weeks ago, but we ended up blowing out our old modem and losing our connection to the internet. And so hopefully we will make it through, and this our current modem will survive the hour, much less the century. So when we did this last time, Leandro was having discussions with people about their predictions. And so we're going to start by some of the scenarios that people have suggested that they think things will look like a century from now. And so we're going to include these in the discussion so that you can all say which one of these you think is right, or maybe you have a completely different idea about what you think the future holds. So historians, I'm a historian, so I'm much better at saying what happened in the past than I am necessarily at predicting the future. The reality is that historians can only predict if things happen based on what has happened in the past. If something completely unexpected happens, which often does happen, there's just no way to make those kind of predictions. And so we won't know for sure, but these are what we're estimating based on trend lines and other things. So the first of these scenarios is the idea that Christianity will survive into the 22nd century, but that's mostly going to be in places like Africa, in South Asia, parts of Latin America, especially Central America, let's say, from which then these places, future missionaries and immigrants may well return religion and Christianity to places like North America, Europe, and surprisingly Uruguay, where things are declining really fast in terms of Christian adherence. So in other words, the cone of South America, which is sort of in religious terms operating like North America, Europe, Australia, and places like that. That's scenario number one. Scenario number two, Christianity will survive into the 22nd century, but not so much as an organized religion, as the denominations will all decline or cease to exist, and instead, maybe there will be a resurgence where individuals express a more spiritual form of their faith that is rooted in these ancient traditions, but is now more personalized. Scenario number three, Christianity will survive in the 22nd century, but it will be a tiny minority religion in contrast to a world that has like a large proportion of the population are simply religiously unaffiliated. So they will say, what religion are you? You'll say none. And that will be a much bigger group or dominant group alongside a growing Islam, which will then become the two dominant groups. And I'm including this one because there is a lot of concern about this, especially in Europe. People talk about this in the UK and places like Sweden. I think that I'm going to say, so that we don't get out of control and have a lot of fear-mongering and worrying in the comments and questions, I'm going to say that I actually think that as we look at demographic trends, that Islam is ultimately going to have the exact same issues as Christianity does, and the reason why it doesn't always look like that is because the trend lines of going to non-adherence happens first and foremost in the most developed countries. And then in terms of immigrants, it takes a generation or so for the immigrants to all follow the trend of the country where people have moved to. And so let's not get too nervous about this one. Forecasting scenario number four, Christianity will not really survive in the 22nd century other than as part of a now post-Christian West's foundational underpinnings. as secular philosophies and practices will emerge that are better suited to people's spiritual needs. So I think that this is the scenario that gets envisioned in science fiction like Star Trek, where people have a kind of a general Western understanding without, when the Federation, the Earth people, Earth people have that, and they're a stand-in for Americans largely in Star Trek. But anyway, where they are largely secular, and they have these sort of kind of humanist underpinnings that ultimately are founded on Judeo-Christianity in the West, but are not overtly religious. Or maybe scenario number 5, Christianity and indeed all religions will go extinct as the world moves towards something like secular humanism. Or then maybe even scenario number 6, once we've gotten to that, there will be some kind of a revival akin to a Second Great Awakening where it starts all over again. So these are some of the scenarios that you guys have mentioned in chats and comments, and so we'll let you discuss them now, and we'll return to them again in our Q&A section to see what different people think, and indeed if you have predicting other scenarios than any of these 6. So when I was talking about trend lines, we can look at studies and data from the Pew Research Center, which is pretty much the foremost institution that is working constantly on trends and polls and data, demographics, trend lines for religious studies. And so if we take, all of the 201 countries of the world, and we divide them, which countries are people who identify as Christians, which are they in the majority within the country, which are people who identify as Muslim, as religiously unaffiliated, as Buddhist, as Hindu, or as Jewish, or other religion. And then in some cases, countries where there is no majority. In other words, there's a plurality of different religions, but none of them have enough to make up a majority. And so if we look at it, Christians still are a majority in 120 countries, and you can see it's this whole red swash across the planet, so it's an awful lot of it still, with Islam forming the majority in 53 countries, India really only in 2 countries, but one of them being a very big country, India, and so, the biggest country now. But now growing in this is countries where the majority of the people, are religiously unaffiliated. They say, "What religion are you?" And they'll say, "None." And this includes, historically communist countries like China, North Korea, Vietnam, where that has been that communism is an ideology that in some ways functions like a religion, and it has anti-traditional religions, and so as a result that has caused affiliation to decline. But there's a bunch of other countries for which just because of free thinking, people have opted out of religion. So places like the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Uruguay, which have emerged into that zone. And then there are countries, like I say, where there's no majority, and that includes now countries like England, or so the United Kingdom and France, where that's happened because of the rise of people who are unaffiliated, and so therefore the number of people that identify as Christian are now not the majority in those countries, even historic centers of Western Christendom. So the other thing that's happening, though, is that that's happening rapidly. And so as the Pew Research Center conducts these surveys along U.S. Census years here, so just between the years 2010 and 2020, several of these countries, when I mentioned the United Kingdom and France, also Australia, they had a majority of people in those countries in 2010 identify as Christian. So, 67% of Australians declining in 2020 now when they're surveyed to 47%. And you can see this same kind of trend line in a rapid ascent. Only a quarter of Australians in 2010 said, none, I don't have a religion. They're unaffiliated religiously, whereas now it's 42. And if you draw how those trend lines are going, you can see probably how rapidly the decline is going to happen in some of the heartlands for Christianity, and how quickly no religious affiliation is rising in those areas. As we saw, several countries, those trend lines have already crossed. And so they'd already crossed 10 years ago in the Netherlands, but now they're on track further afield, where the unaffiliated, religiously unaffiliated form a majority there. That's also true in New Zealand, where the cross happened within the last 10 years, and now the unaffiliated form a majority. And like I was saying, in Uruguay, it's even a steeper incline, which has gotten to an unaffiliated majority in Uruguay. And so, in addition to, like I say, Communist China, Vietnam, and North Korea, the Czech Republic, Japan, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Uruguay, they all identify, people who identify as religiously unaffiliated are now the majority group in those countries. And so I mentioned Uruguay has been interesting for that, because in a lot of cases it has seemed originally like this was a largely Protestant area that this was happening. But it is actually also in many, many developed countries that are historically Catholic, that this is also occurring, including what we say the cone of South America: Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay. And partially this is happening because the rapid change is happening generationally. And so if we go to countries in Europe and we ask the youngest cohort, so people who are aged 16 to 29, how often do you go to church? Or indeed, in this case, this is about religion in generally. This is not just Christianity. So this includes all of the immigrants to these countries or traditional Jewish populations, or anyway. So it would count everybody from all the religions. Do you go? And so at the top of this, in the Czech Republic, we're seeing a supermajority of young people say they never attend a worship service, all the way up till almost 100% say less than once a week, to fill that out. And it's just this tiny proportion of people who are saying that they go weekly or more. And so that is, if we take, all of these countries in Europe, the order here, if you can't read it, is Czech Republic, Netherlands, Spain, UK, Belgium, France, Hungary, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Finland, Estonia, Switzerland, Russia, Portugal. So this is, cross the divides of traditional Christianity between Protestant, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox. It's happening across the board. Never is on the rise in this cohort. Less than once a week is getting you past 75%, and so weekly or more is down to between just a 5% to, in Portugal's case, not maybe 1 in 5 are going weekly. So on that same kind of trend lines and predictions, the National Trust for Canada, so an organization that is committed to preserving all of our historical structures and buildings, the National Trust has predicted that as many as 9,000 of the country's 27,000 faith-based buildings, and so that again is including old synagogues, or including all of the whatever number of temples and mosques that we have, but is primarily to get up to 9,000, we're talking about mostly losing churches. So a third of the churches that exist right now will close within the next decade. And so if it's taken all the number of years we've had Canada to get up to 27,000 places of worship, within, we'll lose a third of them just in 10 years. So that's a staggeringly rapid decline. And I think it also highlights what has been a less visible trend of declining church membership and attendance. So we're at a place now where about a quarter of Canadians report regular religious attendance. And again, this has happened generationally. And so they're historic buildings that have had fewer and fewer and fewer people in them. And now the people who have been the very active adherents and also donors that have kept these congregations alive are now in that age range where they are all now passing on, which is going to cause the buildings to finally close, which is why this prediction is happening. For me, this is just not only thinking about this from a perspective of Christianity or religion in general, but rather we're also at a kind of crossroads as we think about just the general loss of public space. So if we are not going to have churches anymore, and we also, when I was growing up, I lived in a suburb and it was right next to the very first shopping mall in America. And so that was the center of, life for kids in the 70s and 80s, is being mall rats or whatever, right? But now malls are all closing and gone, and even all of the kind of big box superstores that are replacing them are also struggling because so much shopping is now going to be done online. And now what we have instead is just have people continuously running around on bicycles everywhere, delivering everything, which is also an incredible new experience, right? But that means if you don't go to a store anymore, that's a loss of a public space. Same thing, how many people since the pandemic have continued to work remotely. So here in Toronto, we've been building more towers than any other city in North America, but these are all housing towers, and the workplace towers, the office buildings, are, in a lot of cases around the world, struggling to rent. There's all kinds of office vacancies in Manhattan and so forth. And so again, I'm not saying that this is bad, but if we never have any place where we interact with each other, together in a public sphere, because we don't have churches, we don't have stores, we don't have malls, we don't have office buildings and things like that. We are already dealing with an isolation epidemic where people are feeling isolated, and they've replaced social media interactions and video games with having in-person friendships and real friendships. And so, where is this all taking us? Something to think about. So what are the reasons some of this is happening? So in the past, almost all of your personal identity would have been inherited. I mean, this would have included everything, including, your profession. So there's a reason why the name Smith, I say, is both a job and a very common surname in English. Very likely, if you are a son of a smith, you grow up and apprentice to, as a boy anyway, you go up and apprentice to your dad. You'd be in that job. In late antiquity, the Roman and Byzantine empires made that a law so that you couldn't actually escape whatever that position was, because they were running out of people to do all the jobs that they needed, and so you were not allowed to not do the thing. You had to inherit it. Obviously, there became, especially all through the 20th century, new levels and degrees of individualism where people are able to create their own identity, to strike out on their own path. Certainly something that it's been central to my life, where my parents, helped their vision for their kids was not to have them do what they were doing, but rather to give them the opportunity to have fully realized lives, and they've been supportive in whatever path you take. Even, I ended up moving from the United States. I now live in Canada. I have a completely different path than anybody would have ever anticipated. My sister lives in Switzerland, and so on. So in other words, we were the ability to choose for ourselves what path we had. Nevertheless, like past profession, this inheritance of religious identification continued to be true even in developed countries where your religion was generally inherited. So you're much less likely, let's say in the middle of the 20th century, to just go religion shopping. You're raised Methodist and you decide suddenly you're going to go become Jewish. It just really wasn't that didn't happen. You grew up in the church, you stayed in that church, and so forth. However, in developed countries now, that's no longer the case, or it isn't the case by default. So 1 in 5 adults report that they have switched away from the religious affiliation that they were born into. So if you were born a Methodist, you now report that you've decided to convert to Catholicism, you would be one of those 1 in 5. But actually, the lion's share of that 1 in 5 have actually converted from some form of Christian adherence to now identifying as religiously unaffiliated. So that's the big trend. And we can see how that goes in Canada, where the generational collapse is just very, very stark. And so it's maybe not be able to see these lines very easily, especially if you're watching on a phone, but it's kind of easy to identify them because essentially each line, which is showing how people report whether or not they go to church, or any kind of religion. This is all religions, it's not just Christianity. So of Canadians, if you go to a religious or spiritual activity at least once a week, what percentage say that they do? And so each of these lines, as they're going in a little bit of a downward trend from the year 2006 to the year around 2019 here. But what's happening here is it's a decade generational cohort. So the top line here, people who were suggesting that they were doing that at a rate of around 65%, those are people that were born in the 1920s, and the line kind of disappears as they've died out. The people who have said, that they are 60% of them say they're going to a weekly worship service, and that kind of declines to 50%. Those are people that were born in the 1930s. When they say that they had been going, 50% of them had been going, and now only 40% of them say they've been going weekly, those are people born in the 1940s, and so on. And so when you get down to people like me that are born in the 1970s, in 2006, only 35% of them said they went to a religious service weekly, and now that's down to about 30%. And now that we're getting to the last dotted lines, the trend lines here, people who were born in the 1990s, they're saying that they go, only 20% of them say that they go to any religious or spiritual activity at least once a week. So this would include anybody who is in that age cohort who, let's say, is an immigrant, who is Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or something like that. And so in fact, that generational collapse is especially high in Canada. And so the age gap in affiliation is the largest in Canada of any other country. And so that is to say, people who are baby boomers, the older generation, are much more likely to go to church every week in Canada, and the Gen Z folks are most unlikely to not. And so there's a 28-point spread between them, whether or not they're this is not going to church. This is whether or not you are saying you're affiliated with a religion or whether you're saying you're not. And so that means that Canada has undergone generationally a very rapid transition. And topping the chart here of those countries where things are changing fast or fastest are Canada, Denmark, South Korea, Australia, Norway, Sweden, Germany, Japan, Uruguay, Spain, the Dominican Republic, Switzerland, and then we get to the USA. And down from there. So in other words, this is happening pretty fast, and generationally it's happening really fast in places like Canada. And so when we look at this on a map overall, we can kind of see that the orange countries here are places where weekly worship attendance is highest. And so you can see 82% of people in Ethiopia, 89% of people in Nigeria, 72% of Indonesians say that they are going to a worship service at least weekly. And for the most of the Indonesians, that's going to be Islam. They're going to go to the mosque. Nigeria is half and half split between Christians and Muslims, more or less. Ethiopia, that's all Christians. But that's kind of the places where people are going the most. Then you get to kind of the gray areas on the map. The white is no data, so they don't have it, unfortunately, for that. But the gray areas like Brazil and Mexico and South Africa and Turkey and Poland, these are people who half of the people in the country are going to a weekly worship service. And then when you get into the blue, this is the minority. And so US and Canada, only, like we said, 20% of Canadians are going to a worship service weekly, 36% of the people in the United States. And then the darker the blue, the less they're doing it. So Australia is a little further ahead than us, than the Canadians. But a lot of the European countries like Britain, where only 8% of people are going to a weekly worship service, or Sweden, where only 6% are going to a weekly service. And I guess communist China, only 1%. So there are interesting, because of those kinds of quirks of history, outliers too in that way. So as we saw, for the traditional medieval and early modern heartland of Christendom, which is mostly found in Europe, this cuts across all of these lines. So it is not, the red here area on this map is Orthodox Christianity, the blue is Catholicism, and the purple is Protestant Christianity. Initially, this seemed to be happening especially in Protestant churches. But it's now clear that the unraveling is happening in Catholic areas and Orthodoxy. And it's also, the green on here is Islam. And so it is also on the same trend lines there. So in one of the more, the furthest along of the Muslim countries here, it would be like Tunisia, Bosnia, Albania. There's also, you're less likely again to go to weekly worship service than in, in a place that's more like in the middle of Africa, or like we were talking about, or Indonesia. Similarly, as the Pew Research Center has polled people, you'd imagine this would correlate pretty well, but people who consider religion to be very important to them, they are also likely to be the people that are going, and that certainly tracks. So we talked about how places like Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Indonesia, people go a lot, go weekly. They also, 93% of Indonesians say religion is very important to them. Here we actually have data for India, where 80% of the people say that religion is very important to them. 98% of Ethiopians say that religion is very important to them. 72% of Brazilians. But then on the flip side of that, so the US here is actually in the middle, as opposed to where they were in terms of how often people put their money where their mouth is and actually go to church. But here, 53% of Americans think that religion is very important to them, which is more than Chileans or Mexicans. But then you get into this blue area again, like Canada, where only 27% of Canadians say they think religion is very important to them, 10% of Japanese people, 10% of the people in the UK and Sweden, and so forth. So, like I say, some religions are declining faster. It doesn't mean that they're not all going to decline, and they aren't. All the trends, I think, are all following the same direction. But the people that were at the front of this, all of these trains and shifts are Protestants, and especially what we sometimes call the mainline Protestant churches, progressive churches, the more progressive churches. And the stand-in for that here in Canada is the United Church of Canada, which in 1985 was by far and away the country's largest Protestant denomination, and 14.6% of Canadians identified as members of the United Church as recently as 1985. So by the middle of the 90s, though, that had already fallen below 10%, so 9.7%, about 10%. And now fast forward to 2019, just 3.7% of Canadians identify as being members of the United Church. So it's just a rapid decline in the number of professed adherents. Anglicans, so what we say in the United States is the Episcopalian Church, the Church of England in England. So this tradition that Anglo-Canadians have been a part of, the Anglican tradition has also suffered the same level of decline as have other mainline Protestant churches. We're just a few blocks here from Toronto Metropolitan United Church of Canada, which is kind of like the biggest United Church, just an amazing historic building that can seat 2,000. Has this amazing organ, the biggest organ in Canada, where my husband Mike is taking organ lessons there from their music director, and it's just an incredible space. But you can seat 2,000, and it's just not that many people that are going on a Sunday. They're not in trouble in terms of money because I think they have a very big endowment, but even though I love historic buildings, and I love cathedrals, and I love history and architecture, I don't think that I would trade the pastor there, because you're saddled with all of this, and it's very hard to figure out how to regrow from that place compared to the flexibility that we've had here at Toronto Centre Place. So, religious affiliation and importance of religious or spiritual beliefs, it varies if you are native born or whether you're an immigrant. And so it's hard to read the key to this, so I'll explain it. So if you are looking at people who are saying they are non-affiliated, that is the dark blue and the gray. The dark blue are saying that their beliefs are important to them, even though they're non-affiliated, and the gray are saying that they're non-affiliated, but what people believe isn't very important. And so you can see in the three columns on the left are people who are born in Canada, who live in Canada, and the three columns on the right are people who are immigrants to Canada who live in Canada. And these are by generation. So the leftmost of each of the groups is people born between 1940 and 1959, so the boomers. The middle columns are people between 60 and 79, so Gen X, and then the 1980 to 1999 is the third column, so the millennials. And so the top parts here, the larger areas, are people who are affiliated, and the red is beliefs are somewhat important to them, and the light blue is people who are affiliated, beliefs are not that important to them. But you can see again how the generational cohorts are shifting. So the number of people who are affiliated with a religion is declining. The number of people who think it's really important to them is well, it's declining in terms of especially the big in the red portion. But what I also want to point out here is that that things are also change in people born outside of Canada. So this in every case is the this is how it's generationally shifting even for immigrants, even for the first generation immigrant. And then once you're a second generation immigrant, you're part of that same columns on the left, and you start to experience those same trends. And so this is one of the reasons why I've suggested that even though there's this there's a bunch of panic that I've heard, especially when I go to the UK, and I've heard from some Europeans anyway, that the trend lines look scary to them. It's that I think that in the case, no matter how much Islam is holding a community together when they're immediately an immigrant to a place, once you get to the next generation, usually, especially in a place like Canada, where people where people celebrate the multiculturalism and people want to be, part of, more thinking of themselves as Canada. Second generation immigrants never want to know their parents' language anymore. They make fun of their parents. They want to get together with their friends. And so in other words, they assimilate pretty fast in terms of these trend lines. So we looked at how the United Church in Canada is doing, some of the mainline Protestants. Let's look at the Catholics. So Catholicism has also had a huge transformation as one of the founding core religions of settler Canada, where the Francophone population was Catholic, and the Catholic Church was incredibly important in Quebec, all the way up through the 60s, when just a rapid transformation happened and people rebelled against the power of the church, and adherence and weekly attendance just absolutely collapsed. And so we're still in a place where in 2021, 29% of Canadians identify as Catholic adherents. But a lot of that is in part because lots of the new immigrants are also Catholic, and they are providing the lion's share of people who actually attend Mass weekly. So only 4% of Catholics in Quebec attend Mass weekly, whereas the rest of Canadian Catholics, it's 15%. Like I say, 18% of Canadian Catholics are foreign-born. Islam is also growing right now due to immigration in Canada. So in the 2021 census, about 5% of Canadians identify as Muslim, and that's up from just under 2% 20 years earlier. 70% of Canada's Muslim population are foreign-born, and so in other words, first generation. And this is also trending with where things are in Europe and the UK, where, for example, in the UK, 6% of the population identify as Muslim, and half of those are foreign-born immigrants. And so, because of that, the Muslim makeup of populations, depending on how the projections hold, and indeed depending on how much the next generation continues to identify as Muslim instead of beginning to identify as a non-adherent, which is also, it's just also a projection. As the way we look at it right now here, according to these maps from the Pew Research Center, Muslims make up about 5% of Europe's population in 2016. That's the most recent map I was able to get on this, including about 9% of the people in France, about 8% of the people in Sweden, 6% of the people in Germany, 6% of the people in the UK. And the projections that they had at a medium migration scenario is that perhaps as many as 20% of the Swedish population by the year 2050 would identify as Muslim, 16% of the population of the UK, 17% of France, 10% of Germany, and so forth. So, all right, that's a lot of information dump for you guys in terms of some of these. I wanted to have information, though, about the trend lines. also so that we can see, not be alarmist, but also to just see, kind of where things are at. Nevertheless, there are dangers when we start to now draw a line and we see that line and we just assume it's going to go, like this forever. Obviously, there are all kinds of different shifts that happen, and human populations don't change, just in a completely straight line. There's all kinds of different demographic things that are happening, especially when we look at rapid changes that happen generationally. So people have been predicting the end is near for Christianity for a whole long time. But let's look at what we think are some of the other issues. So when I grew up in the 70s, I was a member of a much more fundamentalist church that did believe in the apocalypse would come and that God was going to end the world. But there were all kinds of other ways that the world might end more or less immediately. And the big one that was overshadowing us, of course, was nuclear war, which is still always possible, but it felt much more close, like a more close possibility in reality. But whether a nuclear war happened or not in the 1970s, when we experienced the fuel crisis, when artificial gasoline shortages in the United States and other places that were caused by OPEC's response to Israeli wars in the Middle East, that caused people to imagine what it would actually look like when we start running out, or when we do run out of oil, out of fossil fuels. And so we definitely had in science fiction and other mediums of the time the sense that if nuclear war didn't get us, overpopulation was certainly going to be the time bomb that would make the world, at the very least, into a hell on earth, if not, bringing about a total collapse of civilization. So, for example, in Star Trek, Captain Kirk visits a planet in one of the more terrible episodes of the original series called The Mark of Gideon. And the pretext or the understanding of this planet is that the population, it's so overpopulated, there's no room to even just walk around. And so when you look out the windows into where all the people are, they just can't even move because there's so much overpopulation on this planet. Inevitably, you'd think that you run out of food before you get to that point in the planet, but I guess some of the space is, for food production, and that's why the people have nowhere to walk. Anyway, the birth rate was seen as a ticking time bomb and a disaster that was going to lead to a disaster that was certain and inevitable. And so when I was born, there were 3.7 billion people on the earth, 1970. There are now about 8.2 billion people. And so it was originally projected that that's kind of like a line that was never going to end. We just get more and more people. There's a bunch of science fiction shows from the 70s where they're talking about, kind of a future Earth, and it has like 15, 20 billion people or whatever. And so the only hope on that, since the population was going to keep on going up, was that you just keep on having better and better food production technology, and so you wouldn't get to a point where everybody would starve and the civilization would collapse. But already beginning in the early 19th century with a guy named Thomas Malthus, people have been predicting that the population will overtake the planet's capacity to produce food. And because he was a famous early proponent of this idea, this kind of prediction is called Malthusian or Malthusianism. And like I say, the predicted date that Malthus had never came to pass because we've had the Industrial Revolution, we've had the Agricultural Revolution, which vastly increased capacity, past where anybody imagined would have been possible, in the early 19th century. Nevertheless, by the time we got to the 70s, these technological increases just seemed to be delaying the inevitable. And so I grew up in a Mormon family, and Mormons, like Catholics, had a reputation for big families. I'm the oldest of 5 children in my family, which shows already how, even though despite the reputation, there was actually a decline already happening, because my mom is the oldest of 10 children, and so there's already down. Whereas, my sisters have between 2 and 4 children each. So in the 1970s, there was a Mormon musical called Saturday's Warrior that we put on as in my local area church group, and my sister had one of the singing parts in it. And the theme of this was an existential showdown between this Mormon family who had 7 children that everybody was critical of because they were overpopulating the planet here, or the hippies were, their villains of the movie were upset at them for that. And the enemies are these hippies who think, okay, you're going to destroy the world by causing the overpopulation to collapse. And so the villains outline their perspective in a song. Sorry, Google listened to me and wanted to answer, so I have it on Do Not Disturb, but it still did that. Okay, so the agenda is in the villain's song, and so they sing what they think is the problem to this Mormon family bent on bringing more kids into the world. So they say, every day the world is getting smaller by far, bursting at the seams. What can we do? Zero population is the answer, my friend. Without it, the rest of us are doomed. We need to get to zero population growth so that we can maintain the planet sustainably, is their idea. Who can survive? Who can survive? Not one of us will be alive. Who can be strong? Who can be strong when every inch is gone? We'll all be like the people in that Star Trek episode, The Mark of Gideon, where you can't walk because every inch is gone. Every day the food supply is shrinking away. With starvation at our door, what can we do? Licensing of children is the answer, my friend. Without it, the rest of us are through. So people have to apply for a license to have kids instead of unrestricted breeding, I guess is the idea here. Who can be strong when all the food is gone? Finally, again, in the wake of the fuel crisis, tragedy, our oil is depleting each day. Every baby makes it last a shorter time. Legalized abortion is the answer, my friend. Without it, there is no peace of mind. Who can be strong when all the oil is gone? So I have to admit that, even though I was, a good Mormon kid and I was supposed to be on the side of the Mormons in this musical, the arguments of these villains, given the context that I was living in the 70s, they made total sense to me. So I'm like, yeah, we need to get to zero population. We need to get a license for children, that kind of a thing. So the musical didn't have the desired purpose anyway for me, as they were teaching that to me as a kid. So, like I say, if we have the idea of this Malthusian catastrophe, the idea when I was growing up was the population was going to continue to grow up. Was going to continue to go up in a more geometric way, whereas production of food, even with technological increase, could only be going up arithmetically. And so therefore there would be this huge gap, and that would cause a catastrophe over time eventually. Until suddenly that ended up not being the case. And so now here we are in 2025, and all of the population predictions are not, geometric increase of population, but rather, once we get to the 22nd century and beyond, we can see here on this this chart where we're going up the place to where we are today, 2025, and we see in the 22nd century all those different lines. Those are the future depending on different scenarios of what happens with the birth rate, since it's impossible to entirely predict. But no matter, every one of the scenarios envisions us going over a hump and then rapidly declining to an incredibly much smaller number of people on the planet again in the 22nd century, and then especially beyond the 22nd century. And if we break that down, you can see in the inset chart here, there's this kind of slow projection for the US as its growth kind of settles down between now and the end of the century. It's only maintaining that stability, though, because of significant immigration. It continues to be projected when they made these. If if the trend lines of the last 6 months or anything if those were extrapolated, in other words, if the U.S. makes itself incredibly unfriendly to immigration and immigration evaporates, then it'll go down a lot faster than what is projected on this little graph. But you can see already that China's already past peak. So every year there are now fewer Chinese people on the planet than there were than before. And India, while is still growing, there's a projected peak, between now and the end of the 21st century when things are going to be back down or projected to be back down to where they are today. So in this year, there are 1 million fewer ethnically Japanese people on the planet than there were last year. So there are 1 million fewer Japanese people. And this is because 1.6 million Japanese people died and only 0.6 million were born. Most ethnically Japanese people live in Japan, and most people in Japan are ethnically Japanese. There's a couple other places like Brazil where there's some of them, but this accounts for everybody. Japan itself, its population peaked in 2008 at 128 million people, and it's expected to fall to maybe 63 million, depending on what the trend line is by the end of the century. So, less than half or about half the number of people, which is remarkable. If you can imagine, we just haven't ever had it's an unprecedented situation to imagine in modern times, where you have like a modern, fully developed society and cities and everything like that. And just imagine, what if you had half the number of people that you have right now in them? What does that look like? South Korea's population is actually declining a lot faster than Japan's. China is on also a very fast and swift path. And so this is because of the fertility rate. And so in this case, what you need every woman in the society has to have 2.1 children on average in order to have a replacement rate. So that's if you're going to keep that zero population that the Mormon song in the 70s was singing about. And those countries on this map are in the kind of the gray area. And so that's places like, unless there are no data, but it's places like Indonesia, India, Peru. Those are the ones that are in gray. All of the ones that are any kind of blue have fallen below replacement rate. And then the ones that are really dark blue, like especially South Korea, you can see there, or Greece and Spain and Thailand and Chile and China. Those are the ones that are going to be declining a lot faster because of there's so many fewer children per woman than the other places. Meanwhile, the places that are in kind of tan and then especially getting into dark brown, that is where you have much higher than replacement rate. But again, every single one of those places, as people have projected the trend lines, they're on the same exact path. It's just hitting later, which will also have all kinds of potentially unpredictable consequences for the year 2100, because in a lot of these places that are already incredibly poor, you can see like one of the darkest areas there is Somalia, which has already had a lot of state collapse and so forth. How does it look when you have so many more people there? This is the one that just is staggering. So as all of the combined population of the EU, sort of even with immigration, is projected to kind of stay at about the same population, decline a little bit by the end of the century. Meanwhile, before it levels off, Nigeria all by itself, it's this crazy amount of, it's going to go from having like 200 million people now to having 800 million people. So in other words, it will have more people than the EU. It'll have more people than China, because China will have gone down so many people by then. Just Nigeria. So Meanwhile, though, even though it'll take longer, this is projected the fertility rate, right? So you can already see, this is not population, this is fertility rate. So you can see already, even though there's still a massive increase in the overall population, because the population of Africa is already so young, much longer it'll take. The fertility rate is already in the same kind of decline. And so you can see it's orange and it's at the top, but we're already in the middle of this graph. So we're at 2025. This is starting from 1950 and going to 2100. And so that's, on this route to the same level of decline as everybody else. And so, in order here, Africa is at the top of this, then Asia is gray. And so it's kind of high, and then it's actually dipping lower. And it's actually dipped lower now now that we've got to 2025. The brown is the whole world average. The blue is Latin America and the Caribbean, which went from being high to again dipping lower. Dark blue is Oceania. Green is North America. Yellow is Europe. So you can see it's all heading down below replacement rate by the time we get to 2100. So what's causing all of that? Well, urban life has always correlated to lower fertility. All through like the Roman era and Middle Ages, cities actually absorbed people. So people from the countryside would move to the city and make their name and so on, because the cities themselves were not hitting their replacement rate. And the fact that 81.5% of South Koreans live in cities is probably one of the contributing factors to the country achieving the world's lowest fertility rate, which is 0.72. That is the average South Korean woman will have on average, 0.72 children. So not 2 children that you need, a little over 2 children that you need for replacement rate. But in other words, you don't have there's a 70% chance of only having one or whatever, in other words, most of them don't. I mean, a large percentage will only have one or none. So from its current population of 51 million, South Korea is expected to decline below 20 million by the end of the century. And if it keeps at a really steep rate, it could be as low as 13.5 million by the end of the century, which you can imagine, again, a modern country that's just filled with homes and things like that. We have enough room for 51 million people. To get down to 13.5 million, it just would be kind of a staggering to even imagine what that looks like. Another one of the factors is increased education for women. So once women are able to have, for example, control of their bodies, so they are able to have educational options for being able to have jobs and to make a trade-off between potentially having income and and the cost, the opportunity cost there that having children causes. So educated women tend to delay marriage. They make use of contraception. They also influence societal norms and make it so that it becomes acceptable to societally to not have children. Like I say, once you are educated, once women have a place or a potential place that they could be earning in the workforce, then taking them out of the workforce for your family in order to raise children is a huge economic opportunity cost. So that is definitely one of the factors that affects this everywhere. Surprisingly, though, probably the biggest factor is smartphone usage. So smartphone usage has seen now, it's still new to see, but it's correlating substantially with a rapid decline in the fertility rate, including in the developing world, where people are going straight from, in a lot of cases in rural places where you don't have any phones, you can going straight to having cell phones and smartphones. It affects everybody. So it's, I think one of the reasons for this is it's impossible for real people to compete with our phones for our immediate attention. So the the attraction of social media, wanting to see something that's happening, it wants to catch our immediate attention. And it's very difficult for any real person to be as instantly enticing at all times, at every second, to compete with that. The problem with that, is that the feed, the doom scrolling that you're having, it doesn't get anything. It doesn't get really past that level of getting our immediate attention. It doesn't have that depth of connection that you have, when you make a real life friendship with somebody. And so therefore, then when you actually want that, have that need, you're less likely to have it. And so the Pew Research Center has also been tracking the incredible decline in the institution of friendship, where people of all age groups, especially younger people, and especially young men, as it's, but really with everybody, they're just at the head of the cohort, just in survey after survey over time, reporting fewer friends, and in some cases, no really close friends, has now become also a thing. So as people don't have friendships, they also have fewer sexual partners, less sexual activity, there's less marriage, there's less children, and this is happening even, like I say, in developing countries. So, like I say here, replacing people with phones does not make new people. I'm a big fan of science fiction, as you probably all know. One of these novels that great science fiction author, one of the big ones, Arthur C. Clarke, most famous maybe for 2001: A Space Odyssey. He wrote a novel called The Songs of Distant Earth. And it's envisioning kind of not that far, it's a pretty far future, so the year 3600. Humans learned, sometime a few hundred years from now, they learned that the sun was going to go nova, and they actually were able to date kind of when it would happen. So you have like a timeline. And so initially, that obviously causes a lot of despair and panic, but then you do have a little while to prepare for it. And so that's what, kind of the scenario that he envisioned as he kind of figured out a future history. And so he anticipated that as humanity got closer to that deadline, humans stopped having children, and so it left this very tiny population to inherit the planet during its final years. And so these last humans that were living on the planet called themselves the Lords of the Last Days, because again, there's only, a couple million of them on a planet that had once had tens of billions of people on it, and so forth. And so that's one of the ways I've been trying to anticipate this new idea of what the especially 23rd century is going to look like, with so many fewer people on it than we originally ever anticipated in most science fiction. Also in that book, in Songs of Distant Earth, by the year 3600, in Arthur C. Clarke's telling, religion had long since died out on Earth. A historian in his book explains that this is partially as a result of mathematicians proving that good and bad things happened in statistically equal numbers. So there's no reason to pray to God if or whatever if the good and the bad happen according to that statistician. And another mathematician proved that omniscience, which is part of the idea of God, is not mathematically possible. And I think that illustrates the way many very intelligent people like Arthur C. Clarke don't understand religion, because I don't think most religious people on the planet are anyway motivated by whether or not mathematics or statistics can prove either of those things. So I don't think that's going to be I don't think that either of those is the problem that religion is going to face in the future. But nevertheless, that's one of the things that Arthur C. Clarke talked about as he was envisioning, as so many people have envisioned ever since the Enlightenment, the end of religion. In that book, however, Arthur C. Clarke said that a couple of the old-style religions had successfully colonized a planet or two, and he listed the Mormons as the example. And that is also a real sci-fi trope. In other words, people were kind of seeing, well, mainline churches already, when people were writing these things in the 70s and 80s, were on the decline, but the Mormons seem to be growing, and they must be one of the religions that's going to be able to make it into space, especially considering they're kind of like sort of spacey anyway too, and this becomes a trope. So, for example, in the science fiction novel, but also great TV show, The Expanse, which is one of the best representations of kind of near-term scientific, like a sci-fi that's hard sci-fi, where they're anticipating what actually would be like to have colonized the solar system, as having people living in the asteroid belt and on Mars and on the moon and so forth. They also anticipate that the Mormons are still around, and the Mormons build this generational starship in order to take people on a long voyage to a nearby star that has been observed to have a habitable planet, and they're all going to go on it. And that was part of what people in the 70s and 80s thought. So in 1984, the non-Mormon sociologist Rodney Stark predicted, based on the kind of claimed historical growth rate that the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, had, he predicted that by the year 2080, the planet there would be at least 64 million Mormons, and maybe as many as 250 million Mormons by just the year 2080. And so I even thought back then in the 80s that this was an absurd prediction, because the growth rate was already nowhere like that. But anyway, already by 2025, the LDS growth rate has collapsed. It's similar to all the other denominations. So the same exact thing that I was saying, it looked like, the mainline and liberal Protestant churches all went over the demographic hurdle first. Religions that seem to be growing, like the Mormons and even the Jehovah's Witnesses and so on, are slower in their turning around. Same thing that evangelicals, but the evangelicals are also declining. Pentecostals, that is to say, the developed world especially. And so these predictions are not going to occur. And so probably the sci-fi tropes are also wrong. Like I say, given Rodney Stark's prediction, is that 500% of the people on Earth would be Mormon by 2200. I know that he doesn't think that way, but I feel like he's doing that kind of trend line where he imagines, you obviously can't have 500% of the people be anything, because you have 100%, but people draw these trend lines as if they're going forever. Same thing. Our question then, will Christianity survive the 21st century? Yes, we're having this trend line where from 2000 till 2025, we've gone from 70% of Americans identifying themselves as members of a church down to 45%. That looks like a trend line that'll go to nowhere, but the trend lines are not, they don't go forever in the same direction. So it doesn't mean that negative 25% of people will be church members by 2100, but we want to think, or at least contemplate, what things might look like. Like I say, evangelical churches have growth in part because they understood the new environment that they were in. So unlike mainline churches, which did not update what they were providing to compete with the kind of, so in the past, churches were one of the major forms of entertainment that was available to people. So in addition to being a place of meaning and spirituality and purpose, and marking important life moments and goals, they're also a place where people found entertainment in the pre-TV, pre-radio world. And most churches did not understand that, but evangelical churches have, and have reformed themselves to be big, especially rock concert kind of shows with high production values. And so one of the ways that evangelical churches have seemed to grow is by sucking up all of the members from all of the littler churches, which decline and die around them, the same way that Walmart kills out mom and pop stores. It doesn't mean that Walmart's going to survive, because Walmart is still ultimately having to compete against online shopping and delivery, and that's also where evangelicalism is. Again, so Southern Baptist Convention was one of the main denomination behind evangelicalism, is losing members rapidly, and so on. So, like I say, this isn't a question of whether Christianity survives, but the question remains, what will what's left of Christianity look like at the end of the 21st century? So we should point out, even though we are having here a developed world, Canadian-centric, US-centric focus, Christianity, in terms of raw numbers, is not declining globally. In fact, because of all of these demographic shifts that we've been talking about, Christianity is the largest religion, and it continues to grow. Simply not growing as fast as Islam because of, again, all these demographic issues that we've been talking about, and obviously, the religiously unaffiliated are growing very, very fast as well. So this is where we are at. Like I say, the issue is, though, regionally. And so this, again, is a Pew study. And so if we look at, on the left column here, we're having the number of countries in which the religiously unaffiliated grew substantially in the last 10 years is 35 countries. Muslims grew substantially in 3 countries. Christians grew substantially in 1 country here. And then Christians shrank in 40. Muslims shrank in 2. Buddhists shrank in 1. Other religions shrank in 1. And so you can see on the right-hand column, starting from a place where about a quarter of Christians lived in Europe 10 years ago, a quarter of Christians lived in Latin America, Caribbean, a quarter of Christians lived in sub-Saharan Africa, and then about 12% lived in Asia and North America, very few in the Middle East. That has gone from, sub-Saharan Africa being the biggest region now, with 30% of Christians, and Europe moving into 3rd place, the historic medieval and early modern center at 22%. And again, Asia overtaking North America. Again, not the historic center anyway of Christianity. And so what's happening then is a redistribution as the number of Christians in that big circle in Europe contracts, and the Latin America and the Caribbean areas contracts, North America contracts smaller as Asia Pacific grows, and sub-Saharan Africa, and then is going to be the one that grows and grows and grows going forward until we get to the 22nd century. And that is also tracks with areas, especially where Christians say religion is very important. So Christianity in places like the Philippines and Malaysia, Asia, that's very important to them. Religion is, of course, very important to people, including Christians in Africa and in the middle of Latin America. Still, Brazilians think it's very important. 68% of Americans, so it's still very high in the US. Christians think that religion's important. Canada, we're at 39%, Australia at 27%, and now we get to Europeans, where only 11% of Christians in the UK think religion is very important, and so forth. So you can see it's especially anemic in that traditional heartland. So, one of the things about the religion at the end into the 22nd century that I can't help but wonder about is, what does Nigeria look like? So Nigeria is essentially half Muslim, half Christian now. Both halves are growing. What is that going to look like when the country has 800 million people in that little bit of space in the year 2100? It's certainly unsustainable, so it's hard to know what that will look like. It's not one trend. The trend line doesn't only go one way in particular, because I know that although since the Enlightenment, people of the Enlightenment, deists and so forth, have looked upon a future with no religion or no organized religion, very fondly, and imagined that's going to be great. Individualism means, individualism and free thinking, and so it doesn't. Once you get to one state, it doesn't mean you're going to stay in that state. And so we talked about this idea about inherited identity versus individualism. So we'd said in the developed world, 1 in 5 adults have switched away from the religious affiliation that they were born into. But it's way more than that if you were born into an atheist household. So for adults who were raised by atheist parents as atheists explicitly, now out of those adults, it's not 1 in 5 who've switched away. 2 out of 3 of them have switched away and don't identify as atheists as adults. I mean, they may well just be agnostics or non-adherents or something like that. So it's not, it doesn't have to be dire from the perspective of the atheist, but essentially atheism has a particularly low retention rate as an inherited identity. And, it may well be because people who identify as atheists are free thinkers and would like to have their kids be able to do whatever they want. But there are cautionary tales too. So one of these I heard a long time ago when I was listening to the radio program This American Life. It had a story by Julia Pimsleur, who is a secular Jewish woman, I think atheist, who was raised, their family with Jewish ancestry, and so they could still identify as culturally Jewish, but they had less and less connection to it as a religion, which opened her younger brother up to conversion to a much less sophisticated religion than the religion that their parents had opted out of. And so he ends up joining a Christian cult and moving to Alaska, and obviously has religious reasons for condemning her and her lifestyle, this kind of thing, her identity. And so, again, one of the things that happens is if you don't have any, if there's no forum for an institutional discussion of life's meaning, the meaning of life, then you can also, those questions don't go away. And so people who don't have any background to that may well be attracted into, anything, whatever they encounter. Another thing that happens is getting rid of organized religion doesn't mean that we also get rid of unorganized superstition. Unorganized superstition is ongoing. As Michael Scott from The Office says, well, he's not superstitious, but he is a little stitious. So again, contrary to speculation that since the Enlightenment, the decline of organized religion would mean getting rid of superstition, superstition is live and well and maybe even growing, in the wake of all of this transition. So, for example, according to a 2019 survey of Canadians, whereas only 27% of Canadians, this should say over the age of 45, so people who are Gen X and boomers and so forth, maybe old millennials, while only 27% of them profess a belief in astrology, that number jumps to 49% of Canadians between the ages of 18 and 34 profess a belief in astrology, which is staggering. It's like half. Obviously we don't have to, we can just leave aside that obviously that the whole system of astrology is baseless. But we can also even say, even though it seems like very detailed and it has all of this stuff behind it, but all of that stuff is 2,000 years old. It's completely miscalibrated. The Earth's axis has shifted. If there was anything real to it, it's all off. It was built to make the signs of the zodiac. They're skipping one of the constellations, Ophiuchus. None of these signs that you're born into are the signs anymore. You're all everybody's at least one sign off. It doesn't matter because none of it has any real basis. But if there was any basis to the system, you would want to figure it out. That's not what the point of this kind of thing. All right, same thing. People just have just kind of a lot of personal superstition that they fall into. That's just kind of human nature. So there's a funny skit on a TV show Inside Amy Schumer by Bill Nye the Science Guy, where he's talking about how all this this number of people nowadays who feel like the universe is telling them something. They've gone by, and they've seen this sign a few times, and that's made them, the universe is telling them that they need to do this or that thing. And so he kind of is, sarcastically saying the universe is essentially a force sending cosmic guidance to white women in their 20s, and you shouldn't only be singling them out. Everybody, there's a lot of this going around. But in any event, eliminating an organized forum for talking about life meaning activities, eliminating that doesn't mean that all of these kinds of human questioning or the human needs go away. It just means that people jump to, in some cases, the least thought out conclusions because they haven't had access to what real thinkers have proposed in the past. I'm going to suggest, we'll see, but anyway, a rare but maybe not important counter trend to this whole thing is what we at least hopefully try to do here in Center Place. So in a recently published study in the Journal of Media and Religion, 2 professors looked at the Center Place Beyond the Walls Sunday ministry between the years 2020 and 2022. And they were saying that essentially the total number of weekly participants that we have in our online worship technically fits the definition for a megachurch as they would normally study it in the scientific study of religion. But uniquely, Center Place is a progressive alternative to that. So almost all megachurches are very either very evangelical or fundamentalist or watered down, very simple messaging as opposed to about philosophy or any other kind of or open-ended exploration, open forums. So we don't know though. Where will our own little example of a counter-trend growth lead going forward? So let's go back to what we talked about at the beginning and these different forecasting scenarios as we concluded. Maybe you guys have been having a big discussion in the chats. And so we said, will Christianity survive into the 22nd century, but mostly be strong in places like Africa, South Asia, Central America, and then maybe that will become the source for future missionaries and immigrants to bring the religion maybe in a transformed way into places, its traditional heartlands like North America, Europe, the cone of South America, Australia, and so forth. Scenario 2, Christianity will survive not as an organized religion, as organized religions unravel, but as individual practice, as people find their own individualized spiritual form of the faith. Christianity surviving just as a minority religion around the planet, where unaffiliated is the biggest religion, followed by Islam, which becomes essentially the dominant world religions in the 22nd century. Christianity won't really survive because but it will be the underpinning of the Christian West's kind of secular philosophy and practice that are better suited to people's spiritual needs, scenario 4. All of this stuff is going to go extinct as we get to a kind of secular humanism that Gene Roddenberry would have loved in classic Trek. Or maybe we get to this far future of this planet that doesn't have very many people on it, and something like a revival happens where there's a new Great Awakening. So I don't know. Those are different scenarios that people envisioned when we last approached this topic, and I'm not sure how you have all approached those now. But I'm going to get a drink of water, and Leandro is going to give me your comments and questions, and we can discuss it. Can you scroll it up a little bit so I can see the top of the list, Leandro? So, the highest name I can see is Clifton Stuckey. I need to do that. I'll start there. Okay, so I want to thank people who have been supporting us and people who put money in the chat and so on. So that includes Clifton Stuckey, Nancy Barnett, Catherine Bryan, Neil DeAtley, Kay Dozier, Jeff Mitchell, Richard Tejeda, Jonathan Golden, Sally Gurka, and Fire Ever Living. Thank you all for your support. You make this channel possible. Also thank Magi Mike. Magi Mike says, religion has been viewed as the antithesis of science in the past. Maybe Christianity, like center place, if it becomes popular as we become more educated. Another darker possibility is Christian nationalism. So yeah, I'll say on that, throughout the Middle Ages, and people don't think of the Middle Ages as being a really high point of science, but actually the Middle Ages and the technological revolution that we've had in the West begins there. That's where we start having labor-saving devices. We start focusing on things like the clock, like the windmill, all of those great things. Don't delete too much, then I won't be able to read the next part. Okay. When we, in other words, that was totally in keeping with Christianity, all of science, and that was where it was all on the board with each other. What happened is that during the Enlightenment, clerics, a bunch of Christians, broke away from kind of where the main line is going. They wanted to stop change because they became increasingly literalistic, increasingly focused on things like historicity. They wanted to interpret scripture literally, and so therefore became supernaturalists and proponents of supernatural magic and that kind of thing. So as clerics were opponents of the faster strides that science started making, that's when they broke apart. They don't have to have been apart, and we don't have to have gone on that direction, but that is where the bulk of a lot of Christianity went. And like you say, Magi Mike, that this emergence of Christian nationalism, which I would say, as far as I'm concerned, isn't Christianity at all. I think that that's the same as, like these forms, these modern fundamentalistic forms of Islam that are denials of what Islam truly should be. This is also obviously right in the forefront of where things are at right now, and so it's something for all of us to be worried about. He says, you also say, I'm curious if I've read the article by J.C. Smith, Josephus, and Jesus about the Testimonium Flaviorum. Love to get my take. I've seen it. Let's add that, Lander, let's add that to the Let There Be Answers for next week, and that way I will refresh and make sure that I'm thinking of that article, because I have read a recent article on the Testimonium Flaviorum, and anyway, so I want to, but I'll refresh myself for next week. Okay, oh man, there's a lot of syllables here. Hecatonicosacorum. Hecatonicosacorum says, is there a model using old churches to sustain communities and activities, and how can that work with participation across denominations and religions? So I think there is. In some cases, so in a bunch of cases, so simple, I think in lots of Europe, so what happened in France, I think, is that during the revolution, all church property became the property of the state, and so I think that the state operates all the buildings. And so I think they can still be, maintained as historic structures, public buildings, and even if they're used less and less for religious worship, they could be community centers. In Canada here, they're mostly not maintained for that. So that's one of the reasons why, they're all private structures owned by the individual churches. And so in a lot of cases, what'll happen is, what happened to our old church is it got torn down and they built a a mixed-use condo, so it's mostly became residence. Some of them, if the historic structure is retained, they still make it into condos. You just keep the old facade of the church, but the building, the interior, the ability to have a big community center is lost. Fortunately, the United Church, which has a lot of these buildings all around Canada, is not broke or anything. They just don't have any members or income. And so in a lot of cases, they are made as kind of they become like a charity that is like a community center. So the congregation rents out the facility to all kinds of community groups all through the week. And so it's good when that can happen. I mean, a lot of those are providing a lot of our good public spaces that we need still. But like I say, it's not a fully concerted plan, and the United Church, I mean, although they have some money, they do have to. I mean, these are expensive buildings. In a lot of cases, they have to let them go or sell some of them in order to save some of the other ones. So it's something that we have to be thinking about. I think as a society, not just as not just as religious people, if you're religious people, or secular people, if you're secular. Amanda Zabo, thank you for your support. You said in a previous lecture, you gave a beautiful description about how Catholics view transubstantiation. I can't find it, but I want to share it to the lecture. Can you summarize it or point me to it? So I can look it up. I don't know. I don't know which one that was, Amanda. Let me.
For next week.
Yeah, let's put it into. Let's put this into since it's off topic for tonight. Let's put that into Let There Be Answers, and I'll find the lecture and I'll summarize it again next week. Dave Anderson, thank you for your support. Normative says, how reliable are these surveys in regions where it's still stigmatized to be openly secular? I mean, this is the problem always with self-identification. And so the problem with anything that you do globally is that, if you ask different people across the world, how happy are you, how satisfied are you, different cultures have different, levels of when they would say that. I know from the background of in Mormonism, people always self-identify as being happier than they are. I think they always put a smilier face on things. Because it's a sign of something's really wrong if you're not happy, and so you would self-report happier than some culture where it would be culturally gauche to say you're happy, let's say, and so you would want to say, oh, I'm doing okay or whatever because you're too cool to be happy. So I think that self-identification across a global population is always a little bit of a problem. That said, the Pew Research Center is as good as we got, and they're sociologists, surveyors do what they're able to in order to try to get the best results that we can. And maybe this is one of the reasons why in a lot of cases they leave the map blank and say no data because they weren't able to get it to the level that they wanted. So we don't. I would say can't be sure, especially in those places, but some where it was especially stigmatized. But in some places, it also changes really rapidly. So, we talked about how fast the change happened from everybody being active Catholic to everybody, being Catholics that don't go in Quebec over the course of the Quiet Revolution in the 60s and 70s. And the same thing, there's just been like an incredibly fast change in Ireland as people, on the one hand, Ireland has become much more successful economically lately, and then also I think as a result of the Catholic Church having both scandals about and not dealing well with abuse of children issues by some of the clergy, and then also being on the wrong side of social issues. So it can happen really fast, and that can also be true in Muslim countries. Dartharama. What does John think of the way Robert Heinlein dealt with religion in Stranger in a Strange Land? You'd think I would have read that, but I have not read, I'm trying to think if I've read any of Heinlein. So you would think that as a good science fiction person, I will have read Heinlein, but he is one that wasn't one of my main. I think I read. Did he write a book called Job? I think it was the one I tried and I didn't like it, and so I didn't. And I kind of would read like an author that I really like until the whole end of him. So I read every single thing Asimov wrote and Larry Niven wrote, and so on. Go through Arthur C. Clarke, the ones that I kind of were my people that I really liked. So Normative says, curious for John's take on proposals by secular thinkers like Alain de Botton arguing. Urging development of secular institutions to emulate religion's ritual and community building. Yeah, I definitely think that these are needed, and so I do think that that secular institutions should be trying to emulate those things. So my sister, who lives in Switzerland, she's one of the people whose affiliation has changed, just like mine has, from when we were kids to now. And so she has an atheist who is also what I kind of think of as an atheist activist. But she's also a community building atheist and has tried to, figure out how can we get secular people together to make a kids camp, because the only options for kids camps are often like an evangelical Bible kids camp or something like that. And so how can we get together? And so, in a great, usually the community that is in the North American context anyway, that has done a really good job of that usually is the Unitarians. And so then they can build off of what they're doing. But it is very hard to get together once you've disassembled everything. Once this, again, there's this 27,000 places of worship in Canada, and 9,000 of them are going to be lost in the next 10 years. Once the building's gone, it's hard to go back and rebuild everything. It's very expensive to start over. So it is hard. She found it was very difficult to organize people to do that. And so in some ways it's also hard to reform institutions. It's been very hard for our church to go. It was a very kind of backward provincial kind of fundamentalist church as of the 1950s, and to go to where we are, which is pretty open and progressive now, and it lost just incredible amounts of people along the way, and so that reform has been tough, and it's still ongoing. So I don't know, it is difficult to do that. So it's hard to build from scratch, it's hard to reform, but I think it's vitally needed. Marvin says, is reform a viable option for the survival of Christianity, considering all of the sects and the denominations? It is, because all you have to do, I think, is, that means there's marketplace differentiation. So I think that there's a lot of capacity to make reforms, and my experience has been that when you provide a forum which is for considering life meaningful issues that has kind of a Christian foundation and heritage, but it is not dogmatic, not oppressive, not about judgmentally, judging and all the things that are Puritan and all the other kind of things that are bad about Christianity, that it turns out that there's a hunger for that, and that people are interested in that and come to that. And specifically, on the progressive side, actually having putting out a consistent and professional product, like that's one thing that they do in the evangelical megachurches. This is that they have a professional product, even if I think there's no at best the content is vapid, and at worst it's really hateful and awful, So, but in any event, it's in a good package, and so if there was alternatives like that, I think some people would want to within all that sect and denominations, those are market differentiators. And so now that people are individuals and they can opt in, it doesn't matter that you were born Catholic or a Seventh-day Adventist. If this is available, you could go to that if you wanted to. David Latour asks, what is my opinion? What I think is the most likely scenario out of all those ones that we talked about? So, I mean, definitely Christianity is going to continue to grow for a time, in the across the developing world. I have trouble foreseeing what the places like Nigeria that have the most incredible continuing fertility rate, before that's going to get over an arc and come back. How to be hopeful of that, so that we don't have like a huge component of the planet where things degenerate into hopelessness because there's not enough resources. In other words, this Malthusian future that I grew up on, that I thought was going to be true for the whole planet, I'm still not clear about how we're going to get through it for parts of the planet, and that's kind of one of the parts where there will be a thriving Islam and Christianity. I think that everywhere else we are definitely going to see the kind of decline that they've already seen in Europe, but it could happen a little differently because we're hitting it at a different place. So, like I said, where I'm at is in a place that is very counter-trend. I don't know that there was anybody in the UK. The UK is 10, 15, 20 years ahead of where Canada is demographically in terms of the decline of adherence in Christianity. I don't think there's anybody 20 years ago who was, really promoting, a very, incredibly different way of doing things. In fact, I feel like the Church of England, if anything, was, taking a socially wrong turns and being not inclusive, and more or less making itself not appealing to younger English people, with the result that they have, where the number of people that go is down to nothing. So I think that I think it's possible to try to have reforms where they can happen, and that may preserve something and maybe grow an alternative. But overall, I think that, through much of the world, we're going to get to a place that is nominally secular, but is actually, people are going to have developed a bunch of vernacular belief systems that I would call superstition. So where a huge bulk of the people are going to believe in all kinds of crazy nonsense like astrology, but every other thing like that, where so that there's not going to be any real improvement. In other words, we're not getting to enlightenment because of the breakdown of traditional religion. It just means we don't have an organized public spaces where we can all do charity together. We just can individually make uninformed choices together based on superstitious nonsense. So that's unfortunately, I think that's the most likely scenario. All right, so here's some of the comments from the Insight. So Ricky Palacios says, I feel like if Christianity, like all religions, is going to survive, it's going to need to do something it was never meant to do, which is evolve with society. So I think you're right. If it's going to survive relevantly, as opposed to just as a little thing that's standing on the sidelines, it has to be relevant to society and evolve with it in a meaningful way. Fire Ever Living says, regarding the Malthusian cycle, this was really important and common economic misunderstanding. The world is not zero-sum. People are the ultimate resource creating what we have. That's true. So yeah, so they can be hopeful, therefore, for this 800 million people in Nigeria, that they will have been able to create a system that's, that it's able to sustain them and have that work. Fire Ever Living also says, my biggest concern is that many non-religious and not very religious people are replacing religion with politics and nationalism, which will lead to conflict and illiberalism. Yeah, so I wish that I had sort of thought, as of when the 1970s, growing up again as a kid in the 1970s, that people had gotten the idea, based on the world wars, that nationalism isn't good. The whole point of World War I and World War II was to test out whether nationalism works and to show that it absolutely doesn't, I thought. But in fact, weren't done with it. I guess people didn't learn the lessons from that. And so, like you say, where nationalism is again on the rise in very harmful ways, and that also includes, like you say, illiberalism, because when you are trying to make a strong national conforming identity, that means that you persecute all the people that aren't going to be in what you count as a real version of your nationality. K. Tempest Bradford says, if Christianity is Christianity more likely to survive it if it adopts new saints or venerated people? Should we canonize Yul Brynner of Ten Commandments fame? So I don't know if it is, but I do think that certainly we're in an era with there's a lot of focus on celebrities, including now like the micro celebrity influencers, who are. That's how important everything is somehow.
I need to add some context, John, because we've been having a discussion with photos of Yul Brynner in the Discord.
Oh, okay, okay.
There's been a lot of talk about that.
All right, well, very good. I certainly am a huge fan of Yul Brynner and all the stuff that he did. And so let it be written, so let it be done. So thank you guys so much. So next week we are going to have a Let There Be Answers. So please, all of those off-topic questions that we kicked to next week, we'll do those. But also keep leaving your questions in the chat, and you can email them and so on, and we'll assemble them all. And then we'll also, you can also respond to questions if you're able to be with us live next week. Thanks.